Right, Mark, we know you from a whole range of different things, those of us in the room already. Interestingly, your depth of the tradition and your past. I know you primarily because we've had Queen teas and various discussions in small rooms, and quite often actually not agreeing about everything, which is always a a nice way to spend time with someone, because it really stimulates your brain. I have just spent, as I said, all weekend reading this book, and I've got questions which I just want to show you there. But I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's in 3 parts. So just take us through the structure of the 3 parts in brief, so people who haven't read the book know what they might be getting, and then we'll dig into some of the parts in terms of questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Karenza. And let me start by saying a big thank you to you for setting this up. It's a lovely invitation. It's the first time I've done this with this book. So here we are. I better start by fessing up that this is not actually really an RE book. It's not a how to teach RE book. It's not even a theoretical work about RE, such as I have written in the past. It's a new departure for me. It's, like the title says, it's a meeting point between theology and pedagogy, or more precisely, a meeting point between Christology and the experience of being a teacher, the experience of being an educator, whether that's of adults or young people of any age. And it's my musings. I don't see myself as a theologian. I see myself as an educator who's looking at theology and asking questions. So the first of the 3 parts of the book is called Firstborn, and it's clearing the ground. So I'm starting off by saying a teacher looks at Jesus. What happens when a teacher, an educator, looks at Jesus? What are the questions that an educator might ask and that other people who are not educators might not think of? So I'm asking questions about Jesus himself and about the text of the Gospels. I'm asking questions about the church and the way it preaches. I'm asking questions about the relationship between theology and pedagogy. I've got a chapter called The Dance of Theology and Pedagogy. And I'm saying that traditionally that dance, theology has been the leading partner, the dominant partner in the dance. And that's not particularly healthy. Theology needs to step back a bit and allow pedagogy to lead from time to time. And in the 4th chapter, the last chapter of the first section, is called Getting to Know Him. And if you're already really very well familiar with critical apparatus for reading and understanding the text of the Gospels, then you could probably skip that chapter, because there's quite a lot in it about the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you know, how we read all of that using critical tools and so on. The meat of the book is in the 2nd part, which is called Learning Teacher. When I started writing it, I thought, shall I do 1 chapter each on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and their portrait of Jesus, the teacher? And then I thought, nah, there's got to be a more original, interesting way into this. And all the way through the book, I kept coming back to, what does my own experience as a teacher and a trainer of teachers tell me to listen for? So I started listening for the repeated phrases that Jesus, the teacher, uses in the Gospels. They are phrases like, go and learn the meaning of the words. They are phrases like, you have heard it said, ... but I say to you. They are phrases like, destroy this temple. They are phrases like, this generation does not understand. These are recurrent phrases. Now, why does Jesus use these phrases? Or why do the authors of the Gospels put those phrases into Jesus, the teacher's mouth? And so the chapters in part 2 are drilling down into that, asking the questions that a teacher asks. And I'm going to pull out some examples of that later on. There is a special chapter on John because I think John's gospel is special. It's obviously deeply different from the synoptic gospels. And I'm discussing in that chapter the relationship between Gnosticism and Jesus as a teacher of light, and which of those two emphases, because they're both emphasized in the fourth gospel, which of those two finally wins out. And then the third and last section, how our hearts burned within us, really asks, okay, what do we do with all of that? If we've got some fresh insights into Jesus, the learning teacher, what do we do with all of that? How does it challenge and change us as a church? And one of the chapters in that, I start writing fiction about Jesus from the point of view of a teacher. And there are three short little excerpts of fiction. I don't know if anybody else has read it apart from Carenza, but well, I really love your reactions to it, particularly to chapter 12, which is the fiction chapter. That's the basic structure. One other thing, it is dedicated to someone who had a big influence on my life as a worker in the field of education, and that was Professor John Hull, who died in 2015. And his own book, well, two books, What Prevents Christian Adults from Learning, a book he wrote in the 1980s, and then a much later book, his last book, Towards the Prophetic Church. Both of these books are absolute dynamite for anyone who's thinking about the relationship between preaching and teaching. And they will blow your mind, both of them. So, John Hull, if you're hearing this, thank you.
That's brilliant, Mark. Thank you. One of the unnerving things about going through your book is meeting so many people that I actually know. I had the privilege of meeting John Hull, who showed me who basically revealed to me a monument outside of my work that in 20 years I had never actually looked at. Stone cold blind, taking me round and explained its iconography, and I'd never even looked at it. So he's the man who opens up eyes. And I met him through Jeff Astley and Stephen Barton, because Jeff and I shared an office. It's bonkers. So it's lovely to see the people in here. There's loads of them. Right. Yeah. So we've gone through this wonder, and that's something we should note. That the reason I've got so many people that I'm noting that I know from the book is because I only know about a tiny percentage of it. There's loads of them. The referencing is massive, the learning is massive, but it's all held very lightly. So you might get one paragraph with 4 references to somebody else, but in none of those cases are you befuddled by what they're saying. I think that's really good education, where you can show someone's educational message, but without using ridiculously long language. Sam, if at any point you get lost off with the vocabulary, and I'm not trying to be patronizing towards you particularly, but as a non-specialist, if things like Gnostic and stuff stick in the brain, then yell and we'll explain them, okay? Or somebody else will in the chat.
No worries.
Yeah, don't get stuck with that.
Fab,
okay, so yeah, you're very welcome. I had to look up 3 or 4 words, and there's still one that I don't actually know what it means, so I'm going to ask Mark later. So Mark, we've been talking about Jesus the teacher, which is fabulous. Tell us how you understand Jesus as teacher, because that framework is based on every other premise that you make about the book.
You're assuming I do understand him, and having read the book, having written the book, I'm still not sure if I do. But let me tell you a story, which is my story personally, but it's lots of people's stories, I'm convinced. When I was younger, I assumed that Jesus, the teacher, knew everything, that he was omniscient. Because he was the Son of God, he had come to earth, been born as a baby, yes, but somewhere along the way, he actually knew everything. And the wisdom that he was dishing out in his teaching, in his parables, in his conversations with individuals and groups was the wisdom of somebody who knew everything because he came from heaven. And I only gradually, in my life as a teacher and my career as a teacher, only gradually did I start realizing that that assumption about Jesus, that he knew everything, past, present, and future, was a deeply disempowering assumption. Because teachers don't know everything. So to assume that Jesus, the teacher, knew everything is untrue to the experience of teachers and of preachers. And if we're going to balance Jesus's humanity on the one hand with his divinity on the other, then we've got to do better than assuming that he knew everything. So this started nagging at me in the middle of my career when I was in my 40s, and I'm now in my 60s. So it's taken me that long to articulate all of this and put it into the form of a book. And there were two ways in which it was nagging at me, which I think are very significant for Jesus as a teacher, for me, and possibly for you as well. I hope so. One is that the church has a mission problem. This is a generalized problem, and I'll say a bit more about it. And two is a specific problem relating to one particular passage in the Gospels. And I'll say a bit about that as well. It's the parable of the sower. The mission problem that the church has, and particularly why we are stymied in breaking through to the wider population, particularly in the Western world, is to do with how we talk about Jesus's humanity and his divinity. What was he? Was he parachuted in? Or was he born into humanity and grew through humanity in exactly the same way and with exactly the same pains and joys of growing up that you and I have all experienced? And when a teacher starts to look at this, and when we start to look at Jesus' teaching, any teacher, any person who works with educating people of any age wants to know what is going on in the room. One of the things that a good teacher does is scan the room. One of the things that a good preacher does is scan the congregation, look at their faces. Do they get it? Do I need to explain it better? And so a teacher like me is inevitably going to ask, when it comes to Jesus's use of stories, his use of scripture, what is going on? How does he understand the challenges that he is putting before his learners? And what is the structure of ideas that he is offering to them? And how does that structure of ideas challenge their own structure of ideas? For example, what's more important, ritual purity or justice and community? And he's constantly challenging the structure of ideas that people are carrying around in their heads, often without knowing it. And so his challenge comes through the stories he tells. The more specific thing that was nagging at me is the parable of the sower in Matthew 13. Now, you may not like this, but when a teacher reads the parable of the sower in the Matthew version, I'm not talking about the other versions, you've got a teacher who doesn't prepare properly, who is careless about dishing out the learning to all and sundry without preparation, who then blames 3 out of the 4 learners when they don't get it and don't flourish, and thinks that it's their fault. And there is a kind of willed opaqueness about Jesus the teacher at that point. And when I as a teacher read that allegory, I get very uncomfortable. And I ask myself again, what is going on in the room? Have they got it? Why not? And the parable of the sower, as expressed in Matthew, is a lesson that fails. It is a lesson that fails. And afterwards, Jesus blames the failure on the learners. And in Christian theology and in preaching, we rush to cover Jesus's moral vulnerability at that point. We take the blame away from him. We say, oh, he was testing their faith, or, oh, he was impatient and frustrated. But I think a teacher has got specific insights about that text. And in brief, that kind of specific problem about that specific story got me thinking, what has a teacher got to say about Jesus, the teacher? There's loads more I could say about that, Carenza, but that's enough for the time being, I should think.
Okay, so why don't we ask if anyone's got any responses that they want to make to any of that, or any questions that they'd like to ask you about that, because that's probably quite a good pausing point. Are you prepared to say that Jesus fails as a teacher at that point, because teachers do fail?
Teachers do fail, and yes, Jesus failed at that point, and various other points too. He didn't fail all the time, and he wasn't a bad teacher. He just wasn't perfect.
Right. And you have a new definition for omniscience, which is in the book.
I have a new definition, do I?
Yeah, because, well, basically what you say is omniscience is about knowing what can be known. And you talk about not everything at all times can be known in that relational way. So God can be omniscient. Jesus can know, but he can be omniscient, but he can only know what he can know at that particular period, which is quite a parking of what people often think omniscience might be in the person of Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Briefly, that is a point that John Hull makes in this book, What Prevents Christian Adults from Learning. And he says, things that are not yet known, such as the choice of a baby's name, for example, he says, that doesn't count. I mean, God can't know things that haven't been decided yet. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that omniscience is essentially a Hellenic concept, not an Abrahamic one. And it has been imported via Plato, imported into Christian theology in ways that are not always particularly helpful.
Yeah, if we're thinking about the decolonization of the curriculum, for example, then thinking about the Greek takeover of the Jewish text is also another interesting conversation to have at some point. That would be interesting. So is anybody kind of shocked at this idea that Jesus was possibly not a brilliant teacher all the time, or was a teacher who could learn? Is that an interesting? You don't have to chip in, but I'm just wondering. Lots of very reflective people in the room, Mark. It might come later. Jen?
I'm just sitting here amused because a lot of my schools choose the parable of the sower as their underpinning theological basis for their school vision. And now I'm just sitting there chuckling away, thinking that their whole vision might be based on a lesson that failed, and how I might put that over to them.
Well, the chapter does actually discuss how that allegorical bit crept in.
Yeah.
And if you take the allegorical bit out and sort of set it aside, as it were, then you've got a parable that works as teaching much better. But I think that offers us a potential solution.
I'm gonna read the book for sure.
Yeah. I had to read that bit twice actually, Mark, because I thought at first that what you were doing was putting that parable there and then excusing Jesus as a failure by saying, oh, but we can look at it in this interpretation. I thought, no, that's not going to work. And then I realized what you were saying, that actually it's someone else's get out clause.
Yes, okay. It is. Yes, yeah.
It's someone else's get Jesus out of the failing jail quickly. Okay. So we have Jesus teaching, and you've outlined the kind of the areas around that. Before we move on to the next bit, I just want to poke one thing that I thought was absolutely fascinating, and that is Jesus's classrooms. I loved this idea, right? So just tell us about this idea of Jesus's classrooms and the environments in which he was teaching. And that meant to be in your notes. I'm sorry if this is a sideways swipe, but I just love it.
Sure. Well, okay, it's a chapter called Destroy This Temple. It is chapter 8. And it's the significance of location in Jesus's teaching. I don't think that, as far as I'm aware, I don't think all that many writers on the Gospels have actually paid attention to this particularly, or that many commentaries. But why does he go to synagogues? Why does he go to the temple? Why does he go to the wilderness? Why does he go into vineyards? Why does he go and hang around at the bottom of fig trees? And why does he go to people's homes? Those are the main locations in which Jesus's teaching is set. Forget for a minute whether he actually chose to be there himself or whether the gospel writers place him there. Either way, there's a significance to the locations. And the main locations are temple, synagogue, wilderness, vineyard, fig tree, and home. So 6 of them. And I discussed those 6 fairly briefly. With the possible exception of the wilderness, they all end up in a crisis. If you imagine a teacher who is so dynamic, so deeply challenging, that basically the classroom that he or she is in blows up on them, and that the institution that they're in cannot cope with them, and so he has to move on. That is what happens in many of these locations. There's much more that I could say. There's this odd symbiotic relationship between the temple and the wilderness. And you get that in Hebrew scripture, in the Torah and the prophets, which Jesus had imbibed. And then you get it reproduced in the Gospels. The temple is a very wealthy and very powerful focus of legal and theological authority, deeply corrupt. And alternative movements in Judaism, such as the Essenes, which were very much against the temple and standing for a different type of way of following God. And so when Jesus teaches about the kingdom and teaches about the forgiveness of sins, that is a direct political and economic threat to the temple. And he does that very often from the wilderness. There is this odd relationship between the two at opposite ends of the pole, as it were. You're muted, Corinza.
Sorry. One of the things that I really enjoyed about parts of the book was you just presented some of that as a bit of a binary, but there's not much binary stuff in the book, actually. It does have quite a nice sweep and brings in lots of multiple views of things. And even just for people who are RE teachers or preachers without a huge amount of experience, just the little paragraph on this is the kind of world Jesus was in and its complexities, that, you know, there was complexity within Judaism, complexity within the politics. That is absolutely, it's like a little bit of gold for people just to pick up. So I really enjoyed that. Thank you. So people can keep storing questions, or they can keep making notes or doing a bit of reflection. If you think Mark's going too fast or not fast enough, then give us a shout. Because I've read it and he's written it, we're all on the same page. It might just take a little while for everyone else to let us know if we're on a different page. So the next section that I want you to explore, Mark, is how you think your understanding of this learning teacher who's vivid, dynamic in different classrooms, has a whole range of emotions about people, some very colourful language, does a whole range of things in order to get people to learn. How do you think this might help teachers and preachers and pastors in their own environments? What can each of those people get out of this model of Jesus?
Sure. Okay, thanks, Corinza. James, I think you had a question earlier. Shall we get your question first before I go on?
It was more an observation rather than a question, I think. I've read quite a few pieces in the last 10 years that have tried, or 20 years, to say that Jesus was a good sort of informal educator. So used what he could find. There was some seeds, there was a field, there was a thing. Let's just make a story, almost like improvise a moment of education as the disciples walk through the field and that kind of thing. And look at the birds and look at the thing. And, you know, that kind of, so almost kind of want to say that Jesus was very informal in his educational approach. And there's dangers in claiming Jesus as one thing or the other. And I'm aware of that. I guess one of the questions that's never gets raised in that conversation is actually how successfully is it actually doing the educating. So the location's key, the story's good, the materials are lovely, it's the wheat field and it's the coin and everything else, but it's rarely actually offered. Does it land? Does it work? Does it teach people? Does it, you know? And I suppose your question at the beginning, have you ever thought Jesus as a failed teacher? I've heard it often said that, but he wasn't a great evangelist. because so many people left him. So it's almost like the two go kind of, it's almost hand in hand, almost challenged them too far, and they couldn't see it. They couldn't, you know, it was too much for them to cope with. People didn't want to hear it. It was too hard. I don't think it was too easy. But anyway, more of an observation than a question, and
Yeah.
just things I'm linking that with, I guess.
Well, I mean, you could say that it's a mark of the honesty of the Gospels that they do actually include those failure moments. And we've only mentioned one. I will just drop in another interesting moment, which gets a whole chapter to itself.
Can I just ask you about the one you already talked about first? So I wanted to go back to that. Is that all right, Mark?
Yes, of course. Yes, Janet. Yeah.
It's the sower one. I just want to double check that I understood what your reference was to. Is it to the fact that the minute he's told the parable and the disciple said, "Why do you speak in parables?" he then goes off into this great hissy fit about you never understand, but you're not supposed to. Is that what you're talking about that doesn't come into Mark, or is that the point you're making? I wasn't quite clear.
Partly that, Janet, and also partly the allegory itself.
But he uses the same allegory in Mark, so I don't quite see what you're.
Yeah, but it's more developed, I think, in Matthew, and there is this sense that, you know, the 4 different types of ground are 4 different types of people, or at least 4 different kind of conditions of being, and this has been used, you know, well, misused, I think, in all sorts of ways. It just sits very uncomfortably to someone who cares about people's learning and wants to make sure that everybody learns and makes progress. But if you strip that allegory out, what you've got is a profligate God who scatters grace everywhere.
Yeah, that's how I like to see it. Yeah,
and that is exactly consistent with the other parables in that set. Yeah. And suddenly all the kind of hermeneutical problems around that melt away, because you've got a very simple message, beautifully simple message about a profligate God, a generous God.
Mark, is it worth saying at this point then, and you may come onto it in this section that you're going into, about how the micro examination of small bits, both now and in Jesus' time, is not what Jesus was aiming for. He was aiming for the big picture story, because that's what you've just done.
Yeah. All right. Let's take an example of that, which is in the book, and it relates to your earlier question, Carenza, about what can teachers and preachers take from this. Hermeneutics. There is a chapter called "Go and Learn the Meaning of the Words," and the discussion in the chapter about Matthew 19 and a conversation or discussion or argument between Jesus and the Pharisees about divorce. It's a very complicated passage, and in the passage there's quite a kind of otherworldly, possibly Essene influenced sense in which Jesus is setting impossibly high standards for people when it comes to marriage and divorce. The Pharisees' question on divorce is answered by Jesus in relation to the doctrine of creation. Creation is, Jesus basically goes to a higher order concept. Creation is a higher order concept than marriage or divorce, in the sense that it's older and it's kind of purer and higher. It goes right back to the beginning of the Torah. And so, working from that higher order concept of creation, Jesus appeals to a high notion of marriage, a high doctrine of marriage, as very important, a very important part of the created order. And in effect, he secures that position before engaging in discussion with the Puritans, with the Pharisees about divorce. What I then go on to say in the book on page 69 is a whole paragraph in brackets. And do you mind if I just read this? It's probably the simplest way of getting it. We should note in passing how this exchange in Matthew 19 is misused in contemporary church discussions about marriage, divorce, and same-sex marriage. the single sentence of Jesus, "This is why a man must leave mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two become one body," is taken out of context as an assertion that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. Emphasis on only. Those who read this text as a foundation stone of the notion of male-female complementarity in marriage, without which marriage cannot be real or divinely approved. Male-female complementarity was probably assumed, certainly assumed, presumed by Jesus in this passage. It's presumed, but is it the essence of his argument? Is he saying that it has to be a man and a woman and they become one body? Or is he making just an assumption because that is the norm, the normal way of doing things? Jesus's point is that marriage is part of the creative order. Indeed, it changes the created order by making two into one. And the exchange as a whole is not about marriage or complementarity or divorce or sexuality. It is about have you not read? It is about go and learn the meaning of the words. It is about making sure that people have a clear understanding of the big picture and the big message of the Torah. To use a passage like this, to use that one sentence of Jesus to micromanage ethics about marriage and sexuality in the 21st century is to make exactly the same mistake that Jesus was criticizing the Pharisees for. Exactly the same mistake, using the text of scripture to micromanage one's own ethical behavior or other people's ethical behavior instead of seeing the big picture and the grand narrative. Now that is just one kind of short passage, but I think what comes out of the book repeatedly is this sense in which there is a hermeneutical revolution going on as part of the kingdom of heaven. Change the way you are reading your scripture.
So can I ask a provocative question now, Mark?
Go on.
This stuff, this misreading of scripture is being taught at GCSE and at A-level. In fact, students are getting marks for willfully being misled by their teachers into quoting scripture out of context in order to answer questions about ethical issues on an exam paper. Is that okay?
No. That's not okay. And there are lots of people in the RE world, principally Bob Bowie at Canterbury Christ Church University, who are really concerned about this. And it's the taking of raw bleeding chunks out of the text and out of context in order to make some spurious connections between knowledge of the text and application to current contemporary issues. And
so I guess one of the things that we,
sorry, you got me going now. It's a nonsense.
I guess one of the things I'm flagging up is that there are movements in both education and in theology, and sometimes they're like super tankers. So little boats nip in and out, and the big super tankers are struggling to move. So Bob Bowie's work on sacred texts and that project and all that stuff he's been doing with Dawn Cox and other people, it's absolutely fascinating. But the GCSE world is going to take a yonks to catch up. Yeah. And if the churches move and some aspects of education move up, and if our youth workers move and our preachers move, that's fine. But the GCSE is still telling our young people stuff that's really random about what Christians believe about this, that, and the other, and why, which reinforces yet more prejudice about how outdated the church is or what's going on with the church. So I guess I'm just flagging that up as people in the room who are those preachers, teachers on the front face. You can't change the examination criteria around you, but we can actually offer alternative narratives about how these texts may be used, so they understand that they're contextual within the exam boards. Does that make, is that something that you think would be a good idea? I'm just wondering.
Well, personally, I think it'd be a great idea, and your analogy of the supertanker is a very good one, because it takes a long time to change the exam specifications, and I could tell you all sorts of stories about how we got to that place, but that's probably for another time.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So let's go back to any questions on that? Do flag up your hands or pop them in the chat, because there's lots going on, and I realise I'm an interested party, so I'm not a very good host. I'm sorry about this. But what would you like us to do as teachers and preachers with this person of Jesus then? Or even just look at what you've prepared to take us through. Forget my question. Look at what you're going to talk about next, because I'm distracting you from your own planning.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot to say about how the churches could, digest all of this. Can I tell another story first, though?
You do what you like. It's your Zoom. You're in charge.
There's this phrase that you asked me about it earlier, Carenza, releasing the Christian pedagogical imagination. And it comes particularly in part 3 of the book, when we've got through the biblical material. And essentially we get to part 3, and we're saying in the book, okay, this has been, a set of insights into the Gospels which don't get aired much, but the Gospels half obscure and half reveal Jesus the teacher. It's a kind of palimpsest. It's a shifting text. And if you look at it with an educationist's eye, you can see things that perhaps other people don't notice. And so there's the potential to point new things, new insights out. But even so, it's a limited picture. We will never get a complete picture of Jesus, the teacher. So what do? We use our Christian pedagogical imagination. If we are experienced as people who have preached, people who have taught adults or the young, whether we're qualified teachers or not, doesn't matter. We have experience of trying to explain and unpack, and we bring that experience, that imagination that we have as pedagogues, to our reading of the text. We bring that experience as teachers to our understanding of the Christian tradition. What does that do? Well, I think it hugely liberates and excites us. And I mentioned earlier that there is one section of the book where I'm telling stories. I'm engaging in fiction. May I read you one of these stories? It's on page 143. You'll remember that Jesus is often questioned by the Pharisees and scribes, and by a party called the Herodians. What I'm trying to do here is not original. It's like Saint Ignatius. I'm trying to place myself as a teacher into the story, as Saint Ignatius taught us that we can. And so this discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees, they come along and they try to trick him. They ask him a trick question. Should we pay taxes or not? And what I'm doing with this story is kind of turning it into a contemporary episode in a teacher's life. So without any more ado, let me just read the story. It's about 2 minutes, that's all. Some senior leaders and inspectors came to Jesus with a question that they hoped would catch him out and enable them to condemn him for lowering standards. Jesus, they said to him, by all the reports, you are an inspired teacher and your staff development sessions are a wow. You have said, and we quote from eyewitnesses, the learning I'm looking for is not to be found in the formal measures of pupil progress. The happiest and most real learners are the ones who ponder deeply and say nothing. They really value their learning. You claim that spiritual and moral development are at the heart of your school. I say to you that measurement and judgment are at the heart of your school. So tell us, Jesus, there are so many teachers who struggle with this. How did we get to the state where we value what is measurable rather than doing what we should, which is to measure what is valuable? Jesus looked at them and saw that they were trying to catch him out. He quickly ran through the possible answers in his mind. All of them were dangerous. To say what many of his followers believed, that the data business in schools is useless, oppressive, and a distraction, would provoke accusations that he did not care about high standards or lifting young people out of poverty, and that he was willing to dumb down. To say the opposite, that measurements of progress are important and we must focus relentlessly on them, was just the same old discourse. To say that he recognized the problem but didn't have a solution would look feeble or evasive. To tell his questioners where to get off with their slippery trick questions and fake humility would be to lose the moral high ground. Above all, what Jesus wanted to say was something that would turn the question back on them, while at the same time giving his educational colleagues hope. Something that would render the problem less huge, less worrying, something that would make his questioners look a little bit silly for asking, but stop short of humiliating them. So I'll stop short at that point, because that's basically the guts of the story. What I've done there, which I hope you noticed and enjoyed, is I've tried to get into what was going on in that original story with the Pharisees. And I've tried to get into the teacher's brain that Jesus had. And he's running through his options. He's thinking, shall I say this? Shall I say that? How am I going to transform this situation as a teacher? I really enjoyed writing those bits of fiction because I felt at last I was finding a teacher voice and placing it alongside Jesus's voice as recorded in the Gospels. And it made so much sense to me doing that. And I wrote two other bits of fiction in the same chapter, one of which is about Mary, and the other of which is about the Syrophoenician woman, which is another very troubling text, I think, for a teacher. So those works of fiction are my examples of unleashing the Christian pedagogical imagination and getting into the text with some teacher insights. It's the chapter which I enjoyed the most when I was writing it.
Brought out your creative side, Mark. I think we should do a whole session on your reading of the Syrophoenician woman, because I think I've got some issues with your storytelling. So I would like to learn more about that. I think that's really good. And I thoroughly enjoyed that chapter. It was absolutely awesome. It was really good. I don't know if anybody else is asking their pupils to do that, but that kind of placing yourself inside the story is really important. Can I just read a little bit from your book? It's just one sentence that I think is really, that goes with that as well. And that is this. It's on page 12, actually. In my reading and interpretation, I have not raced ahead to the empty tomb. And it's tiny, that tiny little quote. But I think that's so important in what you've done. You've stopped and tried to take Jesus in his earthly life without all that reading back. And I know we can't do that because the Gospels are written from that perspective. But just stopping doing that for a change and just asking some of those questions, I think is a fascinating thing to do. And I just love the way that kind of happened. And you talked then about the Ignatian message, and that's what you were just doing, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting you should pick on that, because, you know, if we stop and we don't race ahead to the empty tomb, through which that is the prism through which the entire gospel texts are written, then we look at each situation in its own terms, as it were. And that enables us to engage our teacher experience and put that into dialogue with the text. But
it doesn't mean that you're ignorant about saying, why do we think this appears alongside this, or why does this appear alongside that in the narrative? So while you're doing it in its in situ, you're also looking at it in situ in tradition, which I think is quite an important thing to be doing. So that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Carenza.
No, I've honestly, I did really enjoy the book. I got loads out of it. One thing that I'd like us to do before we move on to do some other bits, I think you probably got more to say about, well, when you say I want to release the pedagogical imagination, say a bit more about that, because it's not just about writing creative stories, is it? What else is it that you want people to be doing? Placing themselves in this person of Jesus, not rushing ahead to the empty tomb. What effect does that have on preachers and teachers? What do you want them to actually do in more practical terms? Because you've got a little list in various places of the books of the books. It's a really nice guidebook for those, this is what I think might happen next. That's what you do. You take a vision and you say, how can we do it? So tell us a bit more about that. What do you want people to actually be doing?
Okay, well, there's a section on that in the final chapter, the one about the Trinity and the Church. I'm slightly fearful that that chapter might be a little dry for some people, but it's an attempt to say, okay, if Jesus is a learning teacher, what does that say about the Trinity? And the church is supposed to be a model of the Trinity. It is supposed to reflect on earth the life of the Trinity. So if the Trinity is a learning community, because Jesus, the learning teacher, is part of the Trinity, that is a fascinatingly rich concept. And if the Trinity is a learning community, then the church also needs to be a learning community as well as a teaching community. And I quote from, I think it's Boff, Leonardo Boff, who says that this division of labor between clergy as teachers and lay people as learners is deeply wrong and needs to be challenged and thrown out. He says we need a balance of ecclesia discens and ecclesia docens, teaching and learning. So that has major implications for changing the behavior of the churches in preaching, in ministerial formation and development, in how we talk about the stories that Jesus himself told. My favorite recommendation is to establish a higher standard of hermeneutical competence. I tear my hair out, Carenza, when I hear some church representatives using scripture, what I would call misusing scripture, in order to stake out ethical positions, whether it's on sexuality or on anything else. It is so crude. It is so hermeneutically incompetent, and they are repeating the very behaviors that Jesus criticized 2,000 years ago. And I feel like screaming at the radio or the TV.
You do it on Twitter. You do it on Twitter. I've seen you do the screaming on Twitter.
I do. So, we need to lead people from textual micromanagement of ethics towards using the text in order to see the big picture of God's desire for us. The big picture, the big story in Scripture is God's desire for us. The small stuff is important in some contexts, but it is too often used as a weapon to hit ourselves over the head with, or to hit other people over the head with, people who are different from us. So I think that is the number one thing. Jesus was a hermeneutical revolutionary. And hermeneutics are an integral part of the kingdom that he came to found. And I think I say somewhere in the book, that Jesus did not set new rules for behavior in the kingdom, only for those rules to become permanent, just like the old rules were permanent. He set new rules, and he also set new ways of reading the text. And this is not, as some conservatives would have it, a one-way ticket to laxity or to moral relativism. Jesus actually says, no, if you free up your interpretation of the text, you will deepen the demands of the text on you. And you will find the text challenges you more deeply if you own the interpretation in a more subtle way. So this is not a passport towards relativism or weakness or anything like that. It's the exact opposite. So yeah, I think that's, it's the hermeneutical shaking of the foundations that Jesus as a teacher gave us that has been the most exciting lesson for me for the churches.
We're losing Jenny and James because James is going to the meeting that I'm going to go and run in a minute when I finish this one. And Jenny has to go and do bits for their tea, but she only came on last minute because she saw it being advertised and really liked the title. So they're not going because they don't think you're fabulous, Mark, and their comments are really positive in the chat, which is nice.
Thank you.
I'd
love it if we could. Can we preserve what the chat says after the talk is over?
Yes, I can keep that as well.
I'm not reading them properly at the moment, but I'd love to read them later.
No, you don't have to. That's my job. I do that and pass it to you, and then I'll send you a copy of the chat afterwards.
Fab.
I think one of the things that you've just highlighted, and this is where the book gets dangerous, because you don't do this actually. What you do in the end is you give you this wonderful list of things that you think might be really good to happen, but at no point in the book do you actually sit down and go, you know, church, it's a bit dodgy, isn't it? Because look at what it does. It fossilizes this stuff, and I don't think that's a step that you need to take, but it's implied in quite a lot of where you are going, and you take a radical. So the position about tradition is interesting. I just want to read that one, the proposals, because this is what you've just said, but I think it's really interesting. I have to find it. So whereas you mentioned church all the way through, at no point do you kind of define it now. You stop defining it and it comes back to the people and their relationship. And that to me is not accidental. So tradition, the long-term memory of Christians, overcoming their amnesia, keeping alive the subversive memory of Jesus that haunts the church, its forgetful custodian. And I think that's a really important point. And also, if anyone in the room who's clergy would like to come in on that. Janet, have you got your hand up again about something? Because if you have, come in.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to say, I hope you don't mind me expanding it from Jesus to 1 John, but we had 1 John on Sunday. And to me, the passage we had is doing exactly what you say. It's showing the big picture. God is love, and those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And it's a passage that I use whenever, I used to use it at funerals. I don't do funerals now, but I was always using it at funerals because it gives that big picture. That's what people need to hear, not all the little stuff, you know, because that was to give them the comfort and security and positivity they needed to hear, that God was caring for them and loving them and their loved one who died. That was the big picture they needed, not all the little nitty gritty stuff all the little laws and hoops the church puts in the way. So thank you, I mean, for what you're saying. I just say that's another passage I thought of that did the same thing that we happened to have on Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, thank you, Janet. Yeah.
So what you're saying, Mark, is, I mean, you do talk about how you can radically change ordination training, or how you can ask teachers to think differently and how they can engage with Jesus differently. But we have this massive supertanker that doesn't move very fast, that kind of needs to move, and there could be 2-3 generations of people lost in the middle of all that if we're not careful. And you speak as someone who's been profoundly disappointed by the church as an institution, I think, and there's lots of us in different places who might feel like that, including ordained people in the room, or people who struggle with the fallibility of church. I think that's okay, but I just think it's worth noting as something that's actually in the book. Is there anything that you...
I have been disappointed by the church, but also nurtured by it and inspired by it on many occasions. It's not an entirely negative story, it seems to me.
No, it's not.
And I in the very first chapter, I'm a bit autobiographical, and I talk a lot about my sense of my experience of church, and particularly of hymns as a child. And I'm grateful to the clergy and teachers I had, that they didn't dumb it down, nor did they try to over-explain it for me.
That comes out in that first chapter where you talk about it's almost like the 2 sins of how you might attack the word, and you give other stories about that later on. Just expand on that a little bit for us, because I think that's really important. High challenge, low threat.
Yeah,
that's Mary
absolutely.
Myatt's words, and that's what you've been talking about in what you've been talking about your experience of church.
Yes. Well, you know, there are a lot of churches that claim to be Christ-centered, and in fact, what they are centered on is the human experience of Christ. And there are a lot of churches that claim to be traditional, and in fact, what they're fixated on is specific forms of liturgy, forms of language, and so on, which they like. So, you know, they've taken out the meaning of the word tradition and replaced it with comfort. We are all deceiving ourselves in the church in all sorts of ways, whether we're evangelicals or liberals or Catholics. And our capacity for self-deception is something that Jesus knew and knows, you know, deeply. And the reason why he's a passionate learning teacher of huge, profound challenge to us is because he sees our capacity for self-deception. But I, you know, although I've got these concrete proposals at the end of the book about what things that the church can do and language that the churches can use and so on, I do take the point that the church takes a long time, too long sometimes, to change. Nevertheless, you know, I am not hopeless in that respect. I'm not despairing.
I think all of us here in some way are engaged with church. So I don't think we're despairing either. I think we're fighting from the inside, or at least all in the supertanker trying to help it move by paddling around the edges, if you like. Bill, do you want to come in, sweetie?
I mean, I've been eating my dinner while I've been listening, hence the video being off. So I don't want to upset you all, but I've had a really nice Chinese. But no, I think I really resonate with this sense of getting away from the kind of proof texting approach to, you know, this particular verse or half a verse says this, therefore I can build my whole theology on that for this issue you're facing. And we really have to see that biblical theology. And if you need a verse to sum that up, it would be God is love, and those who live in love live in God, as was said earlier. So, you know, I do think there's a real need for the church in all its denominations and in all its incarnations to get away from that sense of, I can find a sentence in the Bible that supports what I wanted to say, so I'll quote that to you endlessly. And the one at the moment that really kind of winds me up is the number of people who they'll quote, I can do anything through Christ who strengthens me, completely out of context. And as if there's nothing that's insurmountable and that anybody who doesn't succeed is just not trying. And of course, that's not the message at all. So it really warms my heart to have that and that corrective to the fallenness that we all lapse into. And that's why the church isn't perfect and couldn't be. And I actually, just to go back to something really early when I was still having my starter, the parable of the sower, the idea that Jesus wasn't a perfect teacher means that Jesus was fully human.
Yeah.
And as soon as we want to make Jesus into perfection in everything, he ceases to be fully human. So that's really important as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. You could have written the book, Bill.
But he didn't. You did. For which I'm very grateful. Actually, Bill, it's amazing how much this chimes with being interrupted. It just does this over and over again. It's really fascinating. Okay, so we've got our last few minutes. If you want to ask a question or say something, I know that Margaret hasn't had a chance to, and Andy hasn't had a chance to, and Samantha, Jen, please do chuck it into the chat, because if not, what I'm going to ask Mark to do is just tell us a little bit about his notion of Trinity, because I love it. And I don't think it's particularly, it's not that it's not original, I just think it's beautifully written in the book. So if Jesus is a learning person, what are the implications for that, for the Trinity, for the persons of the Trinity?
Okay, so there's this technical term that theologians use about the Trinity, which is the economy of the Trinity. And I better just, in case anybody has not heard this term before, I better just unpack it quite briefly. Moltmann is a very good source for this, Jürgen Moltmann. Theologians are quite shy of writing about the Trinity as it really is, because how can we know? So instead they write about the Trinity as it expresses itself to humanity in history, how the Trinity cashes itself out, as it were. And this is sometimes referred to as the economy of the Trinity, how the Trinity behaves towards humanity in the church, in nature, and in history. And my chapter 14, is talking about an educational economy of the Trinity. And I'm arguing that because the learning teacher is one member of the Trinity, that makes the Trinity a community, a divine community in which teaching and learning, exchange of knowledge is happening the whole time. And I am trying to retain orthodoxy at this point by saying that does not mean that the Trinity itself changes. It simply means that the learning process is part of the changeless way of being three in one. And because the Trinity cashes itself out like that as a learning community, the church, reflecting the nature of the Trinity on earth, also needs to be a learning community. Learning is not inferior to teaching. A teacher is not superior to one who learns. They are both equally worthy and lovable in God's eyes, and therefore in the church's eyes as well. And the dynamism of that, the sense in which the Trinity is a dynamic community, constantly learning, eternally learning, needs to be reflected in the nature of the church. And I'm borrowing quite a lot from John Hull at this point as well, who in the Towards the Prophetic Church, his last book, he talks quite a lot about the pain of learning. And we move when we are learning, particularly if we are adults, it can be a painful process because it involves having to put down some ideas that we have, which we have found comforting, and picking up new ideas, which we may find challenging or even threatening. But such is the nature of life, such is the nature of the economy of the Trinity. So if we wish to reflect that Trinitarian community, that is the path that we must tread, painful though it may be at times. Is that Carenza, is that the sort of adequate kind of summation of that chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think what you've missed out is, because you'd have to read it yourself, is some of the beauty of how that engagement might look. And I felt very at home in that kind of sense of this learning trinity of people working together, learning together, moving together. It made the whole, it took some of the stuff from that's traditionally reserved for the Spirit, I think, and moved it into the other two persons, which I thought was really nicely done. Janet, do you want to come in and say something? How's your head?
No, I just thought I'd better come in for the end. It's a bit better. For
the end. Okay. Yeah. So one of the things that I think I would like to affirm is the beautiful writing, actually. So it's a beautifully written book, and there's lots in it. There's bits and pieces where I want to go, I want to discuss that. So it might be that I have to ring you later for a cream tea, Mark, even a virtual one, so we can go bits and bits together.
I would be up for that. And soon it can be a real cream tea.
Yeah, we'll get back to our real cream tea.
A Eucharistic experience in itself.
I think that would be absolutely beautiful. That would be a really good thing to do. The other thing that you did that is new for me that I have never done before is spending time thinking about how pieces of scripture follow through into Hebrew scripture and what those things might mean as well, which that sometimes is something that I haven't done very much of, connecting the two pieces of scripture without viewing Hebrew scripture entirely in a successionist way through Christian lenses. So I think it's a forward-thinking book in that respect. So hats off to you. It's lovely.
Well, it's very kind of you. It's lovely of you. Thank you.
I just say it like I see it. It's a really good book. I wouldn't have spent my entire bank holiday weekend glued to it, doing nothing else if it hadn't been that good. One of the things that we will do in the Resource Centre, just to note this, is if you would actually like to borrow a copy of the book and you're a Resource Centre member, we will buy additional copies so that you can do that. So you could either go and buy your own, which is always recommended, or you can ask me for it and I'll buy additional copies so that you can borrow it from us. There's lots and lots of points in the book where I've gone, oh, that looks like a key text for Mark. I'm going to order that. That looks really interesting because I haven't heard of that before. And there's quite a few key texts in there that we already have. So John Hull's works and Jeff Astley's works and Stephen Barton's works, they're all in there. Each chapter has a really good bibliography, which is partly makes it hard to read quickly because you actually have to concentrate. So each chapter is small, beautifully written, lots and lots of footnotes that you can go with. And you can take it in chunks, you can do it in thirds, you can do it in whatever you do it. This is, Mark has not told me to sell his book. I'm just telling you that I think it's really good and it's digestible. I'm not one of these people that really enjoys reading words that I've got to keep looking up. But that before we end, I've got one selfish request. What is omnidiscent, Mark? Because I looked it up and I couldn't find a
It's learning
definition.
everything. It's
learning everything.
Yes. Discent is from the same root as disciple.
Okay.
So it means all learning.
Excellent. So from all knowing to all learning. Love this. This is part of a section for everybody else where Mark offers different names for the person of Jesus. How might we offer a new portrait of Jesus? And I'm just going to leave you with this before we go. So a new pedagogical portrait of Jesus. A fiery and passionate prophet with a compelling faith in God, who taught people to expose injustice, hypocrisy, and oppressive theology. A knowledgeable teacher who destroyed and recreated the way to interpret scripture and discern what is right. A clear-sighted teacher who broke the power of oppressive internal structures of theological thought. A courageous teacher whose life and death was a breaking open of knowledge, understanding, and love. We haven't even addressed Mark's work on how the crucifixion and resurrection is and of itself a learning experience and how that might affect how you understand both education and faith. And you know what? I'm not telling you anymore. A, because we run out of time, and B, because the book is worth reading by yourself. So I think we owe a massive debt of thanks to Mark for the work, the learning, the articulate beauty of this book. If you want a copy, email the Resource Centre and we'll buy one in so you can read it. And if you're down south somewhere, Jen, or miles away, then you can either buy one or ask us to buy one and send it to you. We'll see. But I really thank you, Mark, for everything that's in this. I've really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Carenza, and thank you to all of you for coming and taking part in this discussion. And if you do read it, then please say something about it, tweet about it, or write to me about it. Theologians are reviewing it and saying, well, there's not enough theology in it. And educationalists are reviewing it and saying, well, there's not enough education in it. It sort of sits between the two stools. That's exactly where I want to be, of course. And which
perfectly makes the point about the temples that need to have their tables turned over.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's been lovely to meet you all and lovely to hear your thoughts and share my thoughts with you. And thanks to you, Carenza, for hosting it so beautifully.
My pleasure and privilege. Oh no, you're adorable, all of you. Thank you so much. Right, hope to see you all soon. I'm off to my other Zoom. Mark, give me 2 seconds at the end. Sure. Bye-bye, everybody else. Lovely.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hope you feel better, Janet. I'll let Janet. Mark, that was absolutely fabulous. You are so good.
Oh, Carenza, you are good. Let's do mutual congratulation. It was a tremendous discussion. Thank you so much for hosting it. It's a model that I'm going to suggest a few other people do the same thing. You know, fantastic.
Well, I'm not an experienced interviewer at all, but I just think it's such a good book and there's bits in it. And I tend to jump in a bit too early and not give the author enough time to talk, really. But there's so much that's interesting that I want answers to. I just think it's a fabulous book. I am packed to death over the next few days, but if I get a chance, I'll try and write a review for you of the book so that you'll actually have that. I need to make a note of doing that because I think it's extremely good. And you don't write it to convince people, but I found it convincing. And I think there's a lot in there that's very, very beautiful. And, you know, it's no accident we've got 4 ordained people in the room and not a single one tries to defend the church. It's like,
yeah.
You know, yeah. But
well,
it's a lovely book.
Yeah, really generous of you to do this. Thank you so much. When we can, let's meet either in Arnside or in Durham, and we'll do cream tea and more theology, put the world to rights.
Oh, it'd be absolutely lovely to. I would love to, and I'd love to learn more from you because, like I say, there's a couple of bits where I went, I'm not sure that's right. Yeah. Is that what happens? And that I love. Because that's where you learn. That's where you really.
Well, write to me about those bits, and we can have a conversation about that.
Oh, I think I'll just be easy to ring you up with a cup of tea. I think I might have to do that. Because by the time I've written it, I'll lose. I'm too extrovert. I'll lose my thought if I try and write it down. It won't work.
Well, tell me one of them now. No, you haven't got time. You haven't got time.
Oh well,
because you've got to join the other group.
Yeah, I've got 2 minutes. It is basically, it's the end of the Syrophoenician story. And one of the things that struck me was, and I've got to read the versions of it because I haven't had time, is that in your retelling of the story, where you give those 2 possible endings, and you say, well, Jesus might have done this and Jesus might have done that. I thought that the ending of the Syrophoenician woman was not that Jesus did anything, it's that she did it by asking the questions. And he said, you have made this so. So it's not about Jesus staying with the girls and making things better. It's not about the girls not getting where they want to go. It's about the girls saying, you know what, we're going to sort it out for ourselves, love.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And yeah, that's given me food for thought, Carenza. Yes, that she actually takes the situation into her own hands.
Yeah, because I don't think the gospel accounts tell us that he does anything. He says, because you have asked these questions, she will be fine. Or whatever the quote is. I can't remember exactly. I need to go back and find it. I haven't had time to go back and check my Bible references because there was so much in there. I was reading the footnotes. It's an awesome book. I love having my brain stimulated like that. But I'm just wondering if there's another path for that story, which is actually, he says, you know, well, because you've asked all these questions. And she goes, I've asked the questions, I've sorted it out myself. I just wonder. I don't know.
That's really, yeah, that's made me think. That's made me think. And I'm going to go back to the text and think some more.
And then you can email me and go, you read it wrong, woman. Get this right.
No.
No, I'd like that. I'd like that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether my reading is on or off spot. I'm learning. And I love that. I love that.
That's exactly the whole point of the book. You know, we're all learning.
That's what I put in my review. It makes you learn. Yeah. You're awesome. Thank you, gorgeous man.
So are you. Thank you so much. Bless you. Lots of love to you. Now take very good care. Enjoy your next group and write to me soon.
Okay, you keep writing generally.
Yes, thank you. I will. I'm writing fiction at the moment.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised.
Okay, bless you.
Keep going.
Thank you.
Bye.
Lovely to do that. Thank you.
Oh, Mark.
Yeah.
Have you got a favorite color chocolate?
I don't really do chocolate, Carenza.
Okay.
Actually.
Anything else that you do?
Wine.
Okay. Might think about wine.
Yeah.